I buried my son 18 months ago. Or at least, I thought I did. Every month since then, I have sent his wife $750. I told myself it was for my grandson. I told myself it was the right thing to do. My son was gone. My daughter-in-law had a child to raise, and I was still standing. I was 64 years old with a bad knee and a pension that barely covered my own bills, but I was still standing. That had to count for something. His name was Marcus. He was 38 when he drowned. That's what the death certificate said. Drowning, swimming alone in Lake Monroe on a Tuesday afternoon in April, which was already strange because Marcus hated cold water. He always had, ever since he was a little boy. I used to joke that he took after his mother, who wouldn't put a toe in anything below 80 degrees. But the sheriff's department said the evidence was clear. His truck was found at the boat ramp. His shoes were on the bank. They searched for 3 days before they found a body. I identified him myself. I want you to understand that. I stood in that cold room and I looked at my son and I said, "Yes, that's him." I said yes, and I signed the papers, and I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen for 4 hours without turning on a light. His wife's name is Renee. She and Marcus had been married for 9 years, and she gave me my grandson Tyler, who was 7 years old when his father died. Tyler has Marcus's eyes and his laugh, and every time I see that boy I feel the loss all over again, like something being pulled out of me. That was the reason I kept sending the money. Not for Renee, for Tyler. $750 every first of the month. I set up the bank transfer myself. I drove over to their house in Bloomington, about 40 minutes from where I live in Martinsville, at least once a week to see my grandson. Sometimes Renee would let me take him to the park or to get ice cream. Other times she would meet me at the door and tell me he was busy, or he wasn't feeling well, or she had plans. I didn't argue. I told myself she was grieving. I told myself she needed time. I picked up extra work to cover the transfers. I had retired from teaching high school history the year before Marcus died, and my pension was enough for me to live simply, but not enough for me to live simply and send $750 a month to someone else. So I started tutoring on weekends. A few high school kids who needed help with their history exams, a couple of middle schoolers whose parents were worried about their grades. I didn't mind the work. It gave me something to do with my hands, something that kept my mind occupied during those long months after the funeral. My neighbor's name is Carol. She is 61 years old, and she used to be a school librarian, and she has the kind of attention to detail that comes from 30 years of cataloging and cross-referencing everything she encounters. We have been neighbors for 11 years. She brings me soup when I'm sick, and I shovel her driveway in the winter, and we have dinner together maybe twice a month. She knew Marcus since he was in his 20s. She came to his funeral. She watched me grieve. She called me on a Thursday evening in October, about 16 months after the funeral. I was at my kitchen table grading a practice essay for one of my tutoring students, and I almost didn't answer because I was in the middle of a paragraph. I'm glad I answered. She didn't say hello. She said, "Harold, there is a man coming out of Renee's house." I put down my pen. "What do you mean?" "I mean a man, not a repairman, not a delivery driver. A man, Harold, who has been there for 2 hours, and he is just now leaving, and he is walking to a gray pickup truck that has been parked around the corner." I told her she was probably mistaken. I told her Renee was a young woman, and it had been a year and a half, and I didn't think it was any of my business. I believed all of that when I said it. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Harold, I know how Marcus walked. He had that little hitch in his left hip from his football injury in college. You remember? He always leaned slightly to the right when he was tired." I stopped breathing. "This man," Carol said, "has that same hitch." I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself grief does strange things to people, makes them see what they want to see, or what they're afraid of seeing. I told myself Carol was imagining things. I told myself all of this for approximately 48 hours, before I drove to Bloomington on a Saturday morning and parked my car 2 blocks from Renee's house. I had a pair of binoculars that Marcus had given me years ago for bird watching. I had never been bird watching in my life, but he thought I should have a hobby, and I kept them in my glove compartment ever since. I sat in my car, and I watched the house for 3 hours. Nothing happened for the first 2 hours. Renee's car was in the driveway. The lights were on. At one point, I saw Tyler's face in the upstairs window, and I had to look away for a moment because the sight of him standing there, not knowing I was watching, made something ache in the center of my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Then the side gate opened. A man came out of the backyard. He was wearing a dark green jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, and he was carrying a black bag over his left shoulder, and he walked to the end of the alley behind the house with his head down. But Carol was right. There was a hitch in his left hip, a slight lean to the right, a particular way of planting his right foot, first on uneven ground. I had watched my son walk for 38 years. I knew that walk. I drove home, and I sat in my driveway for a long time. Then I went inside and I made myself a cup of coffee, and I thought about it as carefully as I could, the way I used to think through a problem before I wrote it on the board for my students. What do I know? What don't I know? What would I need to know to be certain? I knew that the body I identified had been in the water for 3 days. I knew how much damage water does in 3 days. I knew that I had been devastated and exhausted, and that the funeral home had done reconstruction work before I viewed the remains. I knew that I had looked at a face and said yes because I needed it to be over. I didn't know anything with certainty. That was the honest answer. The following Saturday, I came back. This time, I arrived earlier, at 7 in the morning, and I parked further away, and I brought coffee in a thermos, and I waited. At 9:45, the side gate opened again, and the man in the green jacket came out. And this time, instead of going down the alley, he walked to the end of the street and around the corner. I got out of my car. I want to be clear that I am 64 years old with a bad knee, and I was not going to run after anyone. I walked at a pace that I told myself was casual, and I rounded the corner just as he was reaching the gray pickup truck Carol had described. He was reaching into his jacket pocket for his keys. The cap was pulled low. I said his name. He froze. I said it again. Marcus. He turned around slowly. He was thinner than I remembered. There were lines on his face that hadn't been there 18 months ago. But it was my son. It was absolutely my son. Standing on a quiet street in Bloomington on a Saturday morning. Very much alive. We looked at each other for what felt like a long time. He said, "Dad, just listen." I said, "Get in the truck. I'll follow you." He wanted to argue. I could see it in him. The old habit of pushing back, the same stubbornness he'd had since he was 15. But something in my face must have told him that this was not a conversation I was going to have on a public sidewalk because he got in the truck. I walked back to my car and I followed him to a parking lot behind a closed hardware store 2 blocks away. We sat in his truck. He talked for a long time. I listened. The story he told me was this. He had gotten himself into debt. Not a small amount. He had borrowed money from people he shouldn't have borrowed from, for a business investment that collapsed, and by the beginning of that year the situation had become dangerous. He said dangerous in a way that implied he was afraid for his life. He said he had thought through every option, and the only way out he could see was to disappear. He said Renee knew. He said she had helped him stage it. He said the plan was always to save up enough money and then start over somewhere else, the 3 of them together, somewhere nobody would look. I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Then I asked him how much money he owed, and he told me a number. I did the math in my head. $1,750 a month, he said. The $750 I sent plus another $1,000 that Renee received from Marcus's life insurance policy, which had paid out because the death appeared accidental. $1,750 a month for 18 months. Nearly $32,000. Most of which he said Renee had been putting into an account he could access. I asked him whether it had occurred to him that his mother, before she died, had made me promise to always take care of him. I asked him whether it had occurred to him that I had stood in a room and identified what I believed to be his body. I asked him whether it had occurred to him that his son cried for 3 weeks after the funeral and that I had held Tyler in my arms and told him his father was at peace. Marcus didn't answer any of those questions. He looked out the windshield. I told him I needed time to think. I told him not to go anywhere. I drove home. I want to be honest about what the next 4 days were like. I did not eat well. I slept in stretches of 2 or 3 hours. I walked around my house in the middle of the night, touching things, the bookshelves, the kitchen counter, the photographs on the wall. There is one photograph of Marcus at about 12 years old, standing in front of a lake in the summer, squinting into the sun and grinning. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I thought about all the people who loved him. I thought about his wife's family and my own. I thought about Tyler growing up believing his father had died, and then what it would mean to that boy to find out the truth. I thought about the people Marcus claimed to be afraid of. I thought about whether any of it was actually true. I am a methodical person. I spent 31 years teaching other people's children to examine evidence before they reached conclusions, to ask where information came from, to consider multiple explanations for the same set of facts. I applied those habits to my own son, and what I found did not comfort me. I have a friend named Dale who retired from the county sheriff's department 4 years ago. We have known each other since our kids were in Little League together. I called him on a Wednesday evening and I told him what I had found. I did not tell him everything immediately. I started with the broad strokes and then I filled in the details as he asked questions. And by the end of the conversation, I had told him all of it. Dale was quiet for a while. Then he asked me a question I had not asked myself. If Marcus was really afraid for his life, why had he stayed in Bloomington? Why was he visiting the house? On foot, in broad daylight. Why hadn't they left already? I didn't have an answer. Dale said he would make some calls. He said I should not confront Marcus or Renee again yet. He said I should act as normal as possible, send the money on the first of the month as usual, and wait to hear from him. I did what he told me. I sent the money on November 1st. I drove to Bloomington that Saturday and knocked on Renee's door and asked to see Tyler. She let me take him to the park, and I pushed my grandson on the swings and we ate hot dogs from a food truck, and I looked at his face and I kept everything I knew somewhere behind my eyes, somewhere he couldn't see it. It cost me something to do that. I want you to understand that it cost me something real. Dale called me on a Thursday. He had talked to someone he knew in the fraud division, off the record at first, and the situation had escalated from there. Faking a death to collect insurance was a federal crime. So was the ongoing transfer of insurance proceeds. So was, under certain interpretations, what Renee had been doing with the money I sent. He said if I was willing to cooperate with an investigation, they could build a case quickly. He said I would need to keep acting normally for a little while longer. I agreed without hesitation. What followed was 3 weeks of the strangest normalcy I have ever experienced. I went to my tutoring sessions. I cooked my meals. I raked leaves from my yard. I called Renee on a Sunday afternoon to ask about Tyler, and we had a pleasant 10-minute conversation about how he was doing in school, and she sounded relaxed and friendly. And I said all the right things, and I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen with my hand on the counter until my breathing steadied. During those 3 weeks, I learned things I had not known. Dale's contacts confirmed that Marcus had indeed had a debt problem, but the people he owed money to had been repaid nearly a year ago, a fact that Marcus had neglected to mention when he explained his situation to me in the parking lot. Whatever the original danger had been, it was long gone. What remained was a couple who had discovered that disappearing was profitable and had decided to keep going. The insurance money, my monthly transfers, and Renee's continued employment at her office where nobody questioned the life of a grieving widow, it had all been adding up quietly for a year and a half. They were planning to leave in December. Dale told me that in the second week of November, they had booked flights. The account that Renee had been building had nearly $40,000 in it. They were going to take Tyler and start over in another country. The plan was to disappear a second time, this time together, this time permanently. I thought about Tyler on an airplane, leaving the country, growing up in a place I would never be able to find. I thought about what it would mean to lose my grandson the way I had briefly lost my son, except this time permanently, except this time deliberately, with full knowledge that I was being left behind. On the 22nd of November, I drove to Bloomington one more time. I did not park down the street. I parked in front of the house, in the driveway, the way I always did when I came to see my grandson. I knocked on the door. When Renee answered, I told her I wanted to take Tyler to lunch and maybe to see a movie, my treat, if she didn't mind. She said that sounded lovely. She went to get Tyler's coat. While she was in the hallway closet, The detectives who had been 2 houses down drove to the front of the house. I want to be very precise about what happened next, because I have thought about it many times since. When Renee came back to the door with Tyler's coat, she looked past me at the street, and she saw the cars, and she understood immediately. She was a smart woman. She had always been a smart woman. She looked at me, and for a moment her face showed something complicated, not quite surprise, not quite anger, something that I think was close to relief, as if part of her had always known this day was coming and was exhausted from waiting for it. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." Marcus was not in the house. He was apprehended the next morning when he arrived at the house through the alley the way he always did, not knowing that Renee had been taken in for questioning the night before, not knowing that the house was being watched. He came through the side gate with his baseball cap pulled low and his bag over his left shoulder, leaning slightly to the right the way he always did, and the officers were waiting. I was not there for that. Dale told me about it afterward. He said Marcus stopped walking when he saw the officers and stood very still for a moment, and then he sat down on the back porch steps and waited for them to come to him. Dale said he looked tired. He said he looked like a man who had been running for a long time. Tyler stayed with me while everything was being sorted out. I drove him to my house in Martinsville, and he slept in the room that had been his father's room, with the old baseball pennants still on the wall from when Marcus was a teenager. Tyler is a perceptive child, the way children are perceptive when they have been through loss early. He knew something had happened. He didn't ask me directly. He ate his dinner, and he watched television, and when I said goodnight, he held onto my hand for a moment longer than usual. I sat in the kitchen after he fell asleep, and I thought about what I would tell him and when. That conversation, the real conversation, was going to have to happen eventually. I was not going to lie to my grandson. I had decided that a long time ago, sitting in my car in that parking lot, looking at a face I had spent months believing was gone. Whatever else happened, Tyler deserved the truth when he was old enough to hold it. The legal process moved quickly once it started. The federal charges related to the insurance fraud were serious. The funds from my monthly transfers complicated things further for Renee, as did the flight bookings and the offshore account. I was asked to provide documentation, which I did. I answered every question I was asked. It was not easy, and I am not going to pretend it was easy. Testifying against your own child is not a thing that has a comfortable name. What I kept coming back to, in those months, was a conversation I had with my wife before she died, 8 years ago now. She was in the hospital, and we both knew how things were going, and she asked me to promise her that I would always look after Marcus, that I would make sure he knew he had a father who loved him. I made that promise and I meant it. I believe I kept it. Love does not always look like what the person receiving it wants it to look like. Sometimes love is the thing that refuses to let a lie stand. Sometimes love is the thing that stays in a cold parking lot for 3 hours with a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars and does not look away. Tyler is living with me now. We have a routine. I drive him to school in the morning and I pick him up in the afternoon, and on weekends we go to the library or the hardware store or just walk around the neighborhood. He has started coming to my Saturday tutoring sessions sometimes, sitting at the other end of the table and doing his own homework while I work with my students. He is a quiet kid, but not unhappy quiet, just thoughtful. He asked me once, about a month after he moved in, whether I was sad. Just like that, out of nowhere, while we were making sandwiches for lunch. I told him the truth. I said yes, sometimes. I said that loving people is complicated, and sometimes the people you love do things that hurt you, and you have to figure out how to hold both of those things at the same time, the love and the hurt, without letting either one take over completely. He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "Like how Dad loved you but also did bad stuff." I said yes. Like that. He nodded like that made sense, and he picked up his sandwich, and we ate lunch together in the quiet of my kitchen. And outside the window, the November light was coming through the oak tree in the backyard, the same way it always does, slow and sideways and faintly gold, and I thought about all the ordinary afternoons I had almost lost, and I was grateful. People sometimes ask me why I didn't confront Marcus directly after that parking lot conversation. They ask why I didn't give him the chance to turn himself in, to come forward on his own terms, to spare all of us the investigation and the legal process and the publicity. I understand the question. For a long time I asked it myself. The answer is Tyler. My grandson was being raised by two people who had decided that a comfortable lie was worth more than the truth, that his grandfather's grief was a resource to be managed, that the boy's own memory of his father was something that could be engineered, maintained, adjusted as needed to keep the money flowing and the plan on track. I had no way of knowing what Tyler had been told about his father, or what he believed, or what he was going to be told when they finally left and started over somewhere new. I could not fix all of that, but I could make sure he grew up with at least one person in his life who had decided that the truth was worth something, even when it cost you. That is all I did, in the end. I decided the truth was worth something. Carol came over for dinner 2 weeks after everything became public. She brought a casserole, and Tyler helped me set the table, very serious about folding the napkins correctly, the way he had decided napkins should be folded after seeing it done at a restaurant once. We sat together, and we ate, and afterward Tyler fell asleep on the couch and Carol and I talked quietly at the kitchen table the way we have talked many times over 11 years of being neighbors. She said, "I'm sorry. It was what it was." I said, "I know," she said. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing," I said. "I know that too. It doesn't make it lighter, but I know." She looked at Tyler sleeping on the couch with his arm thrown over his face the way Marcus used to sleep when he was small, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He's going to be all right. You know, he has you." I looked at my grandson and I thought about the promise I made to my wife in that hospital room 8 years ago, and I thought about how promises have a way of expanding beyond what you imagined when you made them, of asking more of you than you thought you were signing up for. I thought about the $750 I had been sending every month. In the bank account the investigators flagged, they found $31,500 that Renee had set aside from my transfers over 18 months. Every cent I had scraped together from tutoring high school kids on weekends. Every hour I had spent at that kitchen table with someone else's child and their history textbook, thinking I was doing something for my grandson. They had kept records. The way people who are planning to disappear keep records carefully, completely, as proof that they had covered their tracks. The investigators told me that the account was being held as part of the proceedings, but that a portion of the funds would likely be returned to me given the circumstances of how they were obtained. I told them what I am going to tell you now. I don't want the money back. Every dollar I sent for Tyler. It was always for Tyler. Whatever the courts decide to do with it, I would like it to go to my grandson. A college fund, or a savings account he can access when he is older, or something that belongs to him, not to me, not to the courts, not to whatever is left of a plan 2 people made in a year when they thought they had everyone fooled. That seems right to me. That seems like the thing a grandfather would do. Tyler is 8 years old now. He is doing well in school. He has a loose tooth that he is very proud of, and he checks it approximately 12 times a day. He has strong opinions about which flavor of ice cream is the best, and he is wrong about this in the way that only children can be completely wrong about something and still be absolutely certain they are right. He makes me laugh every single day, which is something I did not know I still had the capacity for on that April night 18 months ago when I drove home from the funeral and sat in my kitchen in the dark. I am 64 years old. I have a bad knee, and a pension, and a house in Martinsville, Indiana, and a grandson who folds his napkins carefully and falls asleep on my couch and asks me honest questions and deserves honest answers. That is enough. That is more than enough. If you are watching from somewhere tonight, I would like to know where you are. Leave a comment below and tell me. I read all of them. And if this story reminded you of someone you love, or something you have been carrying, I hope you find your way to the other side of it. I found mine. It was harder than I expected, and it took longer than I wanted, and it cost me things I cannot fully name yet, but I found it.